All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So before Emily and I jump in, we just wanted to start off today's conversation by saying thank you. Maybe you decided to join today because you're trying to figure out in your new remote reality how to pivot an upcoming workshop that you have. Maybe you're really interested in how nonprofits just like Splash are using design thinking in intervention planning, or maybe you're just looking for some Friday entertainment. So, whatever brought you here today, we wanted to take a moment to just say welcome and thank you for joining. So, if you're anything like me, you've been faced with new ways of communicating, collaborating, and problem solving over the past few weeks, really, and months. I've been feeling a little bit overwhelmed just with the ideas and tools to help you collaborate remotely, be productive remotely, keep your team engaged remotely. There's so much really valuable content already out there about how to work remotely. But what do we do about larger workshops? So these are things like strategic summits, company retreats, events where you want to do design thinking with some of your partners. These are events that are really important for collective brain power and networking. That was the whole reason why maybe you designed them in the first place. These are obviously, as we all know, events that are really hard to replicate virtually. And the reality is you can't. Remote workshops will never be a one-to-one with the real thing. But what you can do is adapt some of your design thinking methods and still keep momentum by focusing in on what's really important right now for you and your organization. So, our goal over the next 10 to 15 minutes is to share with you 3 lessons that we've learned on how to salvage and also pivot larger design thinking workshops. These lessons are based in our recent partnership with Splash. So, before we dive into all of those really great lessons, I just wanted to take a moment and introduce you to my brilliant co host, Emily Davis.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us over your lunch hour. My name is Emily Davis, and I am the program manager for Menstrual Health at Splash. I'm really excited to be sharing our experiences in pivoting our strategic workshop with all of you today.
Great. Thanks, Emily. We're so happy to have you. And
Thank
my
you.
name is Hannah Hoffman. I'm a design director at Artefact, which is an independent design and strategy firm based out of Seattle, Washington. So I work at the intersection of visual communication, human-centered design and research, and also workshop facilitation. So for those of you who don't know Artifact, in terms of what we do, we create meaningful experiences by designing products, services, and systems with a human-centered approach. And also strategy. We develop methods and prepare our clients to face the future. It comes in many forms, from research to systems mapping. We do all of this under a large philosophical umbrella of responsible design. So now that you've had a chance to get to know Emily and I a little bit, we'll jump into the point of why we're all here today, which is to discuss the strategy summit that we had created in partnership with Splash. We'll also talk about how we pivoted and 3 lessons learned from that experience. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right, so here we are. Before we jump into the lessons learned that Emily and I have, I think it would be useful just to give a really quick background of context why we created this summit in the first place. So Splash came to us to help plan and facilitate a 3-day strategy summit for their girls' menstrual health programs in Ethiopia and India. The goal here was to convene the world's leading menstrual health experts with the intention to set both a vision, a strategy, and a defined roadmap for Splash's menstrual health interventions. So this was going to be realized, as you can imagine, through a variety of design thinking exercise, everything from intervention statements done in small groups around their sort of areas of expertise to really figuring out roadmaps based on those intervention strategies, brainstorming channels, activities, audiences, how we're going to measure outcomes, even doing a small 5-minute pitch, how you can imagine taking your intervention idea, how would you pitch it to a government official? This was what the plan was in terms of exercises for the original summit. And it was going to be enhanced by these peak moments, whether it's an Indian or an Ethiopian coffee ceremony, traditional as you can see here on the left, or even visiting schools, some of Splash's schools in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. We were also going to hear from government officials to just not only get buy-in, but also better understand sort of the Ethiopian ecosystem. That was the original plan. Due to the timing of the evolving COVID-19 pandemic, we made the decision to pivot the summit to be a shorter virtual gathering, both for obviously the safety of participants, but also to be sensitive to the needs of our attendees. So as you can imagine, a lot of the attendees are in global health, and their priorities were quickly shifting to focus on the pandemic. So now Emily will just briefly talk us through how we pivoted.
Great. As Hannah stated, we had a lot of really fun activities planned, ways to engage our participants and make the context of Ethiopia feel tangible and real as we developed solutions to address the challenges that girls face during menstruation. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do that as originally designed, so we had to take a step back and reprioritize. We had to think through what activity was the most critical for us to gain the insights from all of the technical specialists that we had planned to engage. Our solution was to do a 90-minute session followed by a take-home homework assignment. The take-home homework assignment was meant to help participants ideate around interventions and define pilot options for both of our programs.
That's right. So it was a very big shift, as Emily mentioned, from 3 days down to virtual 90 minutes. At the time, the timing of it, we really had a week to pivot. So we really want to share with you 3 takeaways or lessons learned that we have on how to quickly pivot your workshops. So the first one, the first principle that we want to talk to you through is around ensuring watertight alignment. So it's really critical that you simplify your goal, narrow your focus down with your team. And there's 2 ways that we did that together with Splash. The first was we had to elevate the most important objectives when planning. So we know that there are going to be trade-offs naturally that occur in working sessions. One of the biggest being very sensitive to attendee energy and attention span. That's why it's so important to focus. There's no way that we could have done a virtual 3-day summit. It's inhumane for one reason. We also had people from all over the world joining. So that's why we had a discussion on what was most important for Splash and its participants. And we narrowed it down to 2 things. One, we still wanted to find a way for participants to connect and learn from one another. And 2, we also wanted to gather intervention ideas. So when we were talking with Splash, they said the most important thing where we can get the most brain power out of people is to have them do this intervention ideas brainstorm around the built and the felt and the policy environment. So we really had to narrow down from all those activities that you saw earlier to one singular activity. The second is to express clear outcomes you're seeking with participants. So as you can imagine, we don't have the benefit of guiding dialogue as you would if you were in person and facilitating some of these group brainstorm activities. So it's really critical that participants understand what they're expected to do when they go off and brainstorm on their own. As Emily mentioned, we decided to pivot to have it be a workshop environment to accommodate time zones and the way that people like to work over the course of a week. So that's why it was really critical in that 90 moments to build excitement, to express value of why their input is so important, to keep them motivated over that week to help give us some really great ideas. And another way to really ensure watertight alignment is to clearly express what's in scope and out of scope. So I know a lot of times when we're brainstorming, we want to keep it as open-ended as possible. When you aren't there to help facilitate those conversations, you do have to pivot to make sure that you're being really explicit in sort of the boundaries of thinking that you expect from participants.
The next solution or principle that we worked on was building community with intention. We did this through using platforms that all of our participants were comfortable with, using Zoom for the workshop, reducing the number of presenters to just a handful rather than engaging presenters from other contexts, just in terms of internet connectivity and ability to really garner the most insights in a short period of time. In an environment that we traditionally would have been using flip charts, post-it notes, whiteboards, in-person brainstorming and collaboration, we had to think through what does this look like in a virtual environment? So this is where we decided to leverage the Google spreadsheets. We separated out all of the participants into small groups by geography and technical expertise, and sent them a link to a Google spreadsheet where they were given 2 prompts to work on as a group. This enabled collaborators to see each other's inputs in real time and build off of them rather than ideate in a silo. Another part of the Menstrual Health Summit that we were really excited about was the opportunity for participants to network and build relationships. Yes, it was important for Splash to build our strategy and get everyone's creativity and insights, but it was also an opportunity for the menstrual health sector to come together and build important networks so that our work can be cohesive on a global level. And to do this, we encourage participants to share a brief background and their name in the chat box of the Zoom meeting and what they thought was the most important thing about menstrual health to empower girls. This was a really fun activity, and I think I still hear about people saying, oh, I actually saw that person's name in the chat box, and I reached out to them about, you know, this discrete need, and it was really helpful. So we were happy to see that that was an effective approach. In addition to that, I mentioned that we separated everyone out into small groups. These small groups were, as I mentioned, defined by geography and technical scope, but we wanted to be intentional about who was included in what group so that participants had an opportunity to meet someone that they previously hadn't worked with before. In the menstrual health space, which is, I'll admit, relatively small, most of us know the other people working on this content area. But there was an opportunity for people to connect in ways that they hadn't previously outside of like a business development initiative or a need in country. Something that we also had to consider was what giving up control looked like. The small groups, although they were really wonderful opportunities for people to network and to build ideas off of each other, we knew that not every small group was going to be as effective as maybe one or the others where people knew each other or coordinated calls to be able to discuss their brainstorming ideas. That was our opportunity to give up control and understand that, yes, we had to translate a 3-day summit into a 90-minute session. And we recognized that all of those other activities that we weren't able to include in the virtual summit, we could leverage at different times. So the next steps for Splash really are to hold an in-country consultation with government stakeholders after quarantine is lifted, of course. So we're thinking July or August, hopefully, and India and Ethiopia will be able to engage the stakeholders that weren't able to attend the virtual session that might have been able to attend the in-person. So this sense of giving up control, recognizing that expectations do have to shift, but that doesn't mean we can't reach our goals and objectives. It just might look a little different.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily, for sharing that with us. I imagine there's a lot of people in the world right now who are trying to manage that kind of flexibility in their planning for upcoming workshops. So we intentionally wanted to keep this webinar really lightweight. Now we're going to transition to questions that you all may have. So while you may have questions, feel free to ask them in our Q&A chat. We'll answer them. But while you're doing that, while you're thinking of some questions, I have one that we can just start out with, Emily. So for us, obviously, we had to pivot an entire summit in about a week to, to accommodate. Now that we know sort of the ramifications of what's happening with the global pandemic, we know hopefully that as we plan for the future, we have a little bit more time to consider how we might pivot some of our workshops. I'm curious from you what you wish you would have done differently, or now what you can say in terms of advice for people for the future.
That's a great question. Thanks so much, Hannah. One specific thing that I wish we had done differently was I was really excited to see that some of the small groups coordinated their own calls to chat through their brainstorm ideas, but that wasn't something that we had originally mandated. And it was incredibly valuable. And we found that the groups that did do that, the insights that they put into their Google spreadsheet were much richer and more contextually bound. So I think if we were to redo it, that maybe having these even smaller groups come together over the phone and talk things through, maybe even have those somewhat moderated, but loosely so. That's something we definitely do in the future.
Yeah, that's great. We do have one question here that I feel like aligns really perfectly with what you were just describing. And the question is, do you have any tips on coordinating remote collaboration and relationships across different time zones? So there's one piece, Emily, I think we can both answer this. There's one piece that Emily just described, of course, which is trying to find ways for groups to meet on their own across time zones. Another thing that helps is we originally had separated groups by expertise level. So you can always instead decide to organize your groups based on time zones if it is like a pretty large number of folks. And there's obviously a lot of really great collaboration tools out there at Artifact, and even in planning with Splash, we use Miro, of course, is a really good one. However, as Emily mentioned earlier, we're a little bit concerned just on the barrier of entry to some technology, especially in places where internet connection can sometimes be an issue. We didn't want it to be a very big learning curve, right, for people. We wanted to make it as easy as possible for people to brainstorm, which is why we decided to go with Google Spreadsheets. Emily, are there any other tools or tips that you have in the past even from how to coordinate people across time zones?
I think the one tip is that as the moderator or facilitator, I will always lean towards choosing a time that's most inconvenient for me, but convenient for the participants, because in reality, they're doing us a favor by coming, contributing their ideas. So I think removing as many barriers as possible in terms of timing is always a good approach.
Great. All right, we have one more here. It says, when you conduct live in-person workshops in the future, what will you bring or adapt from the digital version? Anything? That's a great question.
Hannah, I'll let you take the first pass.
Yeah, so there's something that I feel like worked really, really well about ours, and that was the introduction that we did with folks. You described it perfectly, Emily, when we had people give their name, where they're from, and just sort of answer a quick prompt. That's something that is super valuable for people to quickly see. However, in person, sometimes that can take a really large chunk of time. Like if we had done that either live in the webinar, not in chat, or if we were doing it in person, sometimes those things can take like 30 to 40 minutes. So I think it's really interesting to just think about like, how can we create speedy moments of connection when we're doing things in person? So I think that's one thing from a digital version. I also think that sometimes we shy away from being really specific about things that are in scope or out of scope for brainstorms because we want to keep things very open-ended. But I think we learned with Splash specifically that there's some intervention ideas that you simply just won't do or like are not feasible to your business, whatever it may be. Like it's not a part of your realm of expertise. So I don't think there's anything wrong with being clear about sort of what you're expecting from attendees in terms of a brainstorm. Is there anything else that you would add to that, Emily?
I think just to add the small groups, again, I think it was our strength because we were able to pair people where we knew that there would be an opportunity for collaboration. They didn't have the same expertise, but they did have the same geographic background. So making sure that you're thoughtful about who is in what small group was really useful to us.
Yeah, that's great. Emily, there's a question here that I feel like would be great for you to answer. It says, how do you decide who to engage and invite as part of a summit or collaborative workshop?
This was tough because there were a lot of people that we wanted to include. I mean, originally when we were doing it in person in Addis, we had to think through budget constraints, of course. We couldn't invite 300 people to this. It really had to stay under 35. And we tried to prioritize, you know, a mix of government, nonprofit, researchers, implementers, so that, again, the ideation sessions were comprehensive and not just one-sided. So that was something we really considered. And it was a lot of like, who has supported Splash in the past and who have we engaged and felt like they were really motivated to contribute? And where is there kind of a shared benefit of collaboration? Of course, we would have liked to expand it out to more people, but it just wasn't an option. But I think that we did a pretty good job of having a mix.
Yeah, great. All right, and so we have a few more questions here. One is, how do you keep a remote workshop, example, 90-minute session, fun and engaging, especially when you need to extract certain insights from participants? This is a great question. I know that I personally feel a little bit drained after a day of, Zoom call after Zoom call after Zoom call. So one way is Felix Chang, who was our also partner at Artefact, who worked on this project, has a saying that I absolutely love, which is zap, don't sap. So when you are presenting, especially in a remote environment, you need to be double the amount of excitement that you would be in person in order to keep people engaged and feeling energetic. Another way that we did it with Splash specifically is definitely just mixing up sort of the agenda of what people are doing. So we had a really great introduction at the beginning that kind of set up the mission and vision of Splash. We got into really specific research and insights from in-country data, and then we jumped out and talked about brainstorm. So I think you need to apply the same rules that you would to an in-person workshop, switching things up when you can, as much as you can, and also just making sure that there's still moments throughout the entire workshop to have people connect. Emily, is there anything else you would add to that?
I would just say, when you talk about sharing out research, that can sound a little dry, but we were really intentional in including a lot of imagery and framing the findings around our formative research so that whoever was listening felt like they were walking on the shoes of the girls that we interviewed for the data collection. I think it can be pretty dry giving percentages and health outcomes and things like that, but saying this is the experience of this girl and these are the challenges she's facing. I think that's a good way to keep research exciting for people that are new to the content area.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so we have one more question here. How did your outcome goals for the workshop shift when you pivoted to a digital experience? Emily, I think that would be a great one for you to talk to.
Yeah, I mean, they completely shifted. I thought, if you asked me 6 months ago, I'd say we'd have a strategy and roadmap for both country programs by March. I was very certain that after the summit, we would have all the information we needed to really push forward and push out a strategy document for review by both of the governments in each country. Now, I think that it's a blessing. We have all of the insights from the technical specialists, and we have this period of time where we can really take a step back and think, what do we want to pilot? What do we want to make sure is culturally relevant and is comprehensive of all of the components that would really improve the menstruating experience of these girls? And so now our approach is, rather, instead of having a strategy right now, we have 4 candidate pilots for each country that we're fleshing out in detail, exactly how we'll implement the pilots, how we'll evaluate them and iterate, and then also how we'll engage government to get their buy-in in the design of the pilots. Rather than sending them a strategy to react to, we'll bring them along the journey so that they can see the pilots and feel like they contributed and own it. So I do think it was an odd benefit, but really happy that that's what has happened.
Yeah, sometimes I think design thinking exercises create so much energy, especially when you're bringing in people from around the world. And we did have to get really, really focused and clear on where do we want to channel that energy now, and what are some things that Splash can sort of take and work on their own. That's always a hard balance, but I think you all have done a really great job of making that shift. One other thing that I think would be good to touch on, maybe we can revisit, that I also thought of in terms of what will we take forward from this digital experience or virtual workshop. And one thing that I thought was really interesting was in terms of the way the brainstorm was laid out in Google Forms. We know that it's not the most visually appealing thing, and we know that working in a Google spreadsheet also isn't like the most inspiring environment for people to create their own ideas. But it also allowed people, I think, to brainstorm on their own in whatever way that they wanted to. And I do think that there are moments sometimes in brainstorms where, especially if you're in smaller groups of 5 to 6, let's say, a lot of times there do end up being one or two participants that are usually the most vocal. So what was really interesting, I think, about this more virtual experience of brainstorming, especially when it's on their own, is it does create a little bit more equity in terms of how people are sharing their ideas. And it allows you to sort of like walk away, take a break from it, and come back to it. So that's something that I think is a good lesson for a facilitator, but also something just that we might find ways to bring forward in the future. All right, so that wraps up our questions piece. Emily, do you have any additional questions that you think we should let the people know?
I don't think so. I think we covered everything. Thank you so much, Hannah, and a big thank you to Artefact in helping us through this crazy process. We couldn't have done it without you, so I just want to extend my gratitude to you and Felix.
Yes, absolutely. And I do have maybe one final question that we can end on. We created so many amazing exercises and workshop materials. Do you have any thoughts of how you might repurpose those in the future?
I mean, I might frame them for my living room, but they were gorgeous. I mean, they really were outstanding and so dynamic for what we are going to use them for. I think that there's definitely an opportunity for future human-centered design sessions with government stakeholders. All of these, smaller versions of the summit that are going to have to happen. I definitely see us using these tools in the future.
Great. Good to hear. All right, everyone. So that wraps up our webinar for the day. Thank you so much for joining. This is part of a larger series of Design by Impact that we've been running at Artefact, and we are so happy today to be able to share this with our Splash partner and Emily Davis specifically. And so just know that if you're thinking about how to transform a workshop to a remote environment, or you want more tips on how to keep that energy up in some of those remote sessions, Artefact is 100% here for that. So thank you so much. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your Friday.